Thank you.
Yes, Eliza.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to the first conversation on volunteer tourism. My name is Elisa Burrai. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Events, Tourism and Hospitality Management at Leeds Beckett University. And I jointly coordinate the Atlas Special Interest Group with my colleague David Esterkle, who's here with us today and who's done a great job of helping me together with Atlas, the speakers and moderators to organize this series of events that are just starting today. So as I said, this is the first of 3 events, and is jointly hosted by our school and Atlas. David and I would like to thank everyone for being here today, and our 2 wonderful speakers. And I'm not going to speak for much longer since we have an exciting program ahead. I just wanted to remind you of a few things. We are together for the first 45 minutes. We'll have a little session for questions and answers from our audience, for our speakers, and a short 5 minutes break. Then we are back again together for the second and final block, which follows a similar pattern. So our speakers will chat about their research on volunteering, development, and volunteer tourism, and then we'll have again time for questions and answers from the panel to our speakers. So do please use the chat on YouTube and on Zoom. So that's pretty much all in terms of housekeeping. So keep the questions coming throughout the event. And now I have the great honor to welcome our 2 speakers, Giovanna Di Matteo and Matt Bailey-Smith. Giovanna Di Matteo, who is coming from the University of Padua in Italy. She holds a PhD in geography, and her doctoral research project is titled Migrant Support, Volunteer Tourism in Border Islands, Space and Memory in Lampedusa, Italy, and Lesbos, Greece. Giovanna's research interests include the critical tourism, migration studies, mobility studies, and cultural heritage. Giovanna will chat about her research on volunteering and volunteer tourism with Matt Bailey-Smith, who is a professor of international development at Northumbria University, UK. He is leader of Northumbria University's Global Development Futures Initiative and co-director of its Center for International Development. Matt's research focuses on civil society, citizenship, and development, with particular interest in volunteering in humanitarian and development settings. Matt is also interested in young people and the climate emergency. He's currently involved in a number of projects where he's also principal investigator, and is currently working on a project, for example, on refugees, youth volunteering in Uganda, a large interdisciplinary project on voluntary labor amongst the refugee youth in Uganda. And he's also working on the project Volunteering Together, exploring how volunteers work together in different contexts. Matt also works in partnership with and advises a range of humanitarian and development organizations on issues around volunteering, development, and education. So I'm not going to waste much more time, and I'm passing over to Matt, who's going to open this first conversation. Thank you very much, Matt and Giovanna.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, thank you, Elisa, and it's really nice to be here, and I hope we can have a really good conversation. We were saying just before this started that Giovanna and I kind of had a really interesting time, kind of looking at each other's papers and thinking about connections, and it's really great to be prompted to do these kinds of things. I think sometimes we don't do this enough, and sometimes we don't do it enough after the paper when we've had a chance to kind of reflect. So what I thought I'd do for 10 minutes in the context of the paper that I've been asked to talk on rethinking volunteering and cosmopolitanism is think a little bit about the journey towards this paper and then what happened kind of afterwards. So trying, and it's been very useful for me looking at this and kind of revisiting and remembering what's happened to some of my thinking since I wrote the paper, and maybe how it's informed things, or maybe what didn't quite work or has gone wrong or whatever. So I'm going to try and give a sense of why I wrote the paper, then a little bit about what it tries to do, but in a sense that's not the interesting bit because you can read the paper and that's kind of straightforward. And then a little bit about one or two ideas that have fallen from it that I've tried to pick up and do stuff with. I think the first thing to do, though, really, really important, is kind of acknowledge my co-authors on the paper. So Nisha Thomas and Sean Hazeldine, co-authors, who, it's worth noting, are not academics. Nisha was briefly, but they're development practitioners and humanitarian practitioners, and I think that's a part of the story we'll perhaps come back to. I also want to thank the paper draws on a big project which I did with IFRC, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent. Lots and lots of people are involved in that, and their contribution has obviously shaped some of the things I'm going to talk about. So what the paper, I think, tries to do is to try and rethink or think a little bit more about how we understand volunteering and the work that it produces and what it is in a particular place, but to not parochialize that. So you'll see later on, I'm sure, there's some really interesting connections to Giovanna's paper looking at volunteering in place, but actually expanding expanding the spatialization of volunteering. That's what's so great about Giovanna's paper, and we'll come back to that. So I thought maybe I'd just give a sense of why do I think that's important? Why do we need to do this? Why do we need to think about what volunteering means? But this is tangled up with my own biography. You know, for some years I was working on international volunteering. I was working on the gap year, and that revolved a lot around researching kind of subjectivity, researching citizenship. But what I found interesting in all that if you look at a lot of the literature on international volunteering, and to some extent volunteer tourism, it doesn't really talk about what volunteering is, right? There's a lot of focus on mobility and spaces and places that volunteering takes you in and out of. But it's almost like what kind of labor volunteering is kind of assumed. It's just a thing. It's just sort of, we don't talk very much about the kind of work it is. And you can see that because there's a big disconnect, I think, between the kind of spaces we're in this call we're probably all going to talk about and the kind of voluntary sector studies kind of debates, which are often seen as quite different. So what happens, I think, as a result? So one of my questions in all this is that researchers tended to look at mobilities of international volunteering and volunteer tourism. Do those mobilities create an open difference? Do they create a kind of cosmopolitan sensibility? But only some mobility seem to count, and kind of volunteering seems to be assumed. So that's my first kind of starting point of where there's some gaps here. I think a second starting point was that this growing sense in policy and academia that kind of volunteering is ubiquitous. Everywhere has volunteering. There are cultures of volunteering everywhere. You'll see the UN using that language. But this seems to me to be really problematic. Because what it does at one level is what Jazeel talks about, that kind of violent normalization of particular ideas of volunteering and voluntary labor. In other words, the global north's idea of what a volunteering is and what a volunteer does and who volunteers are very dominant, but almost that history is written out. A second problem seems to me, by saying volunteering is everywhere, that we don't talk about how ideas of volunteering and voluntary labor move and circulate through those kind of circuits of humanitarian and development and tourism, that the idea of what a volunteer is moving all the time. And that's partly policy mobility. You have global organizations and dialogues with organizations, but it's also about people embody and carry with them particular ideas of volunteering within and between places, and then they bump into other ones, but we're missing that. And I think taken together, what this does is there's a risk of kind of parochializing volunteering outside these kind of dominant conversations about volunteering. And you can see that in the way that the voluntary labor in the global south is woefully under-theorized and underexplored. But there is a risk that in looking at, by saying, well, we're now going to look at the ideas of volunteering in Uganda, for example, that you then parochialize it. You kind of go, well, there's international volunteering and there's volunteering in Europe and North America, and there's all these connections. But when we look at it in Uganda, we write out those connections. We write out those kind of spatialization, that sort of the geospatial politics. A third motivation for me around this paper was that so much of the debate around volunteering and humanitarian and development intervention is contained within those debates. So, and this is what I really like about Giovanna's paper, because it totally steps away from that, that volunteering is kind of within the kind of temporalities of projects, of particular timeframes, of certain temporalities that come from particular places. So there's a set of intellectual things that I suppose, intellectual academic things that I was trying to do, but also a very practical side to this paper. And it's slightly weird to be writing about cosmopolitanism and assemblage theory in the paper as I do, when I say I'm also doing it from a practice space, because they're not exactly accessible languages for policymakers and practitioners. But this paper also came from starting to work with IFRC, the Red Cross Federation, when I worked with them to co-author what they became the IFRC Global Review on Volunteering. And a conversation really that led to that was a realization that the numbers of volunteers outside the dominant circuits that I was looking at, working with VSO and others in international volunteering, we didn't know enough about. And one of the things that came out was that how stable are ideas of volunteering as they circulate and move, and what investments are made, what power is needed to stabilize these ideas in particular ways. So it led to this kind of reflection on an openness to changing ideas of volunteering. What happens when ideas of volunteering move? Do they rub up against dominant ideas and are just shut out? Or do you lead to a kind of more transformative possibility? And can more fluid understandings and transformations of voluntary labour lead to more transformative possibilities for development? Can we critique development? Can it challenge development? So the paper was trying to kind of make sense of some of these circulations and say, well, what happened? What are the relationships that make up volunteering in a particular place and as it moves? And can we identify ways to be, what are the conditions when it can be more transformative? And to do that, we decided to use kind of assemblage thinking, which the geographers amongst us, I'm sure, will be very familiar with, and I don't want to spend a long time on it today. And I should acknowledge here the kind of input from Lynn Staley, who's a fabulous geographer who sadly died a few years ago, who really pushed me on this when we were talking about this. So for those who don't know, assemblage thinking is a way about thinking about the kind of socio-spatial, which emphasizes kind of emergencies and multiplicity and indeterminacy, and it emphasizes how things come together and disperse, and how that constitutes a kind of formation in a particular moment. And I was interested in, well, does this help us destabilize some of the fixings that we've got of development of volunteering, the ways in which volunteering, kind of the languages and the ways we talk about volunteering have become very contained, spatially contained, and in other ways? And does it open us to thinking about different mobilities? And I wanted to think about, as these things come together and disperse to make volunteering, what does that mean? How do we understand that coming together? And so to give just a couple of examples, one in the paper we talk about someone who's a volunteer in a country who is then displaced and arrives somewhere else, and they briefly become a beneficiary, but then they also become a volunteer, and that brings their volunteering into play. And then they return home with an idea of volunteering that's now informed by all these experiences of circulating within that space. So is it, across that story, I think the answer no, that volunteering is a knowable fixed thing. And we know what volunteering is. That doesn't change. It's this person circulating. And of course, that isn't the case. What happens is volunteering as a practice is worked and reworked and changed and moves. But I don't really feel that we acknowledge and recognize that. And then the question becomes, how do those kind of articulations and these multiple relationships and the way that volunteering perhaps changes and kind of does different things, does that enable a more transformative kind of politics of development? A second example might be diaspora volunteering, where the UK government, very strong promotion of diaspora communities in the UK, then volunteering in the global south. And what then happens, you get ideas of citizenship and home and development and who's an outsider, what home means, kind of circulating and moving through these different ideas, which means that what volunteering is and how it is understood and goes through these relationships, it isn't really recognized. We don't really talk about it. And so it seemed to me these two examples, the two little nuggets from the paper, can I give an example of how people kind of carry with them ideas of volunteering, and they bump into other ideas and they articulate within our policy. And what volunteering is constituted. There's a volunteering assemblage that is made in particular moments and then unmade and moved. But we tend to think about, we know what volunteering is. So there's this kind of broad argument, I suppose, that we need to rethink how volunteering is made in a particular place. And I'll finish by just saying kind of what that's done, I guess. And this relates to the Review, the project that was mentioned at the start in Uganda, and I can share details of that if anybody wants afterwards as a website and so on. And it's looking at youth volunteering, young refugees volunteering in Uganda. And our data shows how particular ideas of volunteering are circulating in Uganda. And some are heavily invested in, and some others are not. Very programmed ideas of volunteering tend to dominate and shape what volunteering discourse is. And it means that some people are excluded. It means that some humanitarian systems are bolstered by some kinds of volunteering. But the problem is, if we don't recognize these circulations and the inequalities between these ideas as they circulate, then it's, in a sense, we just accept dominant ideas of volunteering and voluntary labor, which means we silence long histories of other forms of voluntary labor. And so for me, I suppose this paper was an attempt to look at some of these rationalities and to see kind of what some of the limitations were of what we currently have and whether we can open up different ones. And I think in the second half, we'll see how there are strong connections to Giovanna's paper around this. And I'll stop there. I think you're muted, Elise.
Sorry, I forget about all these technology details. Thank you, Matt, for this. I'm sure Giovanna will have some questions or comments. As you mentioned already, there are lots of commonalities or points that intersect in terms of your research interest, but also the type of research you have conducted on volunteering. So over to you, Giovanna, to ask Matt some questions or comments.
Thank you. So first of all, hello everyone. I'm really, really excited to be here and to have this opportunity to engage also in this conversation with Matt. And I really enjoyed getting to know better your work. So I was really happy about that. And as you already said, and as Elisa mentioned, I also figured that we had a lot of convergences in our work. So I'm also very excited about that. And in particular, I have to admit that reading your work also made me rethink a lot about mine, which I think it's positive. It means that it works. So that being said, I wanted to make this short introduction about what I felt reading your work, because I think that it will have to do a lot with my comments. So again, my first impression was that there was something in common, even though, of course, the approaches are different, the goals were different. But however, I thought it would be interesting even just to go through some sort of keywords or some, I don't know, some terms and concepts that resonated to me while reading. So, for example, when you mentioned contested relationalities, or the effort to move the research gaze even away, from the service delivery aspect of volunteering, or the fact that you mentioned a focus on the processual, relational, and contingent aspect of volunteering. So these are just examples, but I thought, I mean, these were the first impressions I had when reading, that there's something was converging. And besides that, among the theoretical frames that you used, I found particularly interesting the idea of cosmopolitanism, even because personally I was not very familiar with it. So it was very useful for me to approach it as well and to get to understand a little bit better this idea. And it kind of opened some possibilities in my reasonings about volunteering. As I mentioned, it really made me think about my own work. So in particular, I found it fruitful to deconstruct it, as you mentioned in your work, the universalism of volunteering and its values. So in this sense, I'll try to make an example. I hope it will work to engage in this conversation of my research, from my research. As when researching on volunteer tourism, in this case on Lesbos and on Lampedusa as well, because I did a sort of comparative research, I found myself struggling in trying to find a way to challenge the idea of volunteering as humanitarianism in the sense of an individualized challenge. And so the challenge of being a caring, responsible and active citizen of the word. So at the same time, without discarding all the positive aspects that volunteering may carry. So I'm not sure if I'm oversimplifying, but I kind of found myself in this struggle. And I'm trying to get to the point here. I was aware that the relational aspect of volunteering was emerging as a relevant aspect, and more specifically, in my research, I was trying to figure out how to frame and give sense to these relations among volunteers. And in this sense, it kind of, I kind of found it as a way to interpret the relationships with among volunteers, the concept of transnational citizenship. So in this sense, found it on a humanitarian basis. But in this sense, I found, again, myself kind of struggling between the individualization of the responsibilities and the individualization also of the relation making and the privilege of being able to make those relationships within this concept of transnational citizenship. So, I mean, without going way too far in the example, but and I was wondering, reading about the concept of cosmopolitanism, how this could, like, it seems to me that there is a basic difference between these two concepts, citizenship and cosmopolitanism. But I would like you maybe to expand a bit more about this. Tell me if I'm completely wrong, if I didn't interpret it correctly. And so, yeah, I don't know if it was clear enough as an example, but please let me know in case I can explain it a bit better. And a second aspect I would like to discuss with you is related to another sort of case studies, but in this case that you mentioned specifically in your paper. And this is exactly the same example you just made at the beginning, when you talked about the volunteering and migration example, which I found very, very useful, even because, of course, it closely relate to what I've been working on. And in particular, my attention was captured by the idea of that identities of people as volunteers may change according to their personal circumstances and their status in that moment. And so when you say, for example, I'm reading this because I loved this sentence, so I'm sorry if I'm just reading it, but you say they may then return to their country of origin or move on to different settings, embodying and expressing traces of multiple volunteering ideas, practices, and experiences that can provoke shifts and contestation at different scales. So for me, this was like, a very important point, because I also found some parallelism with my own experience as a researcher, but as a volunteer. Indeed, I volunteered myself during my research, and I found myself getting to know and to engage with what was called, in Lesbos at least, the resident volunteers. So basically those migrants and refugees who would volunteer themselves while basically being stuck on the islands, waiting for their papers and so on. So this was very interesting because I think, as an example, I think it puts together also other bits of your research, at least that I was able to read in the paper. For example, the fact that volunteering, what you get back from volunteering, let's say, for example, the fact that someone would would expect or would be paid or would have something to gain from volunteering, which maybe goes farther away from the common idea of volunteering. Of course, people get to volunteer because they get something back, but this is another topic. However, to go back to my example, those volunteers, the resident volunteers, of course, would get something from their volunteering, which would not be a monetary payment, but would be more a gain in the sense of, let's say, privilege. For example, they would basically get access to safer spaces outside camps, which were really important for them, or they would be able to visit other parts of the island. So they were able to be mobile on these islands, or get out for lunch, dinner with volunteers, so create actual relationships outside the camp, which was not the only occasion, but it was a very important one. And most of all, they were able to change the role from the cared for to someone who was caring for someone else, or anyway was the same level of the hierarchy, let's say. So also in this case, I wanted to bring up this example and leave it to you for comments. And finally, I have a last question, and then I'll leave it back to you, and then maybe we can go back to other points. I'm sure there will be time. My last question, actually, you already said a lot about this, so I was very happy that you started with this point. It was about mobility and the role of mobility in the context of volunteering, because as you mentioned yourself, on one hand, the focus on mobility of international volunteers risks to discard other types of volunteering or other types of mobilities, let's say, and focusing only on the elite mobilities, on the privileged mobility and so on. So I wanted to ask you, what other role can mobility have, as you mentioned, not only physical mobility, but maybe mobility of ideas and so on. So I'll stop here and leave it back to you. I hope. I mean,
thank you, Giovanna. Yeah, over to you, Matt, for the final 10 minutes before we open up to the audience for questions. Thank you.
Wow, fabulous. There's loads in it. I wish I'd spoken to you before I started the paper, because that could have saved me a load of time. I'll try and work through these and maybe give some connections. I think they're really useful observations, and I think some of them are things that I've then started to think about in other work. And I think your first point was about that, the kind of, I suppose, my discomfort with the ways in which volunteering is contained by kind of service delivery and the kind of very bureaucratized kind of ways of understanding it. And I think this paper only goes some way to doing that. I think we wanted to do that. I think it's quite hard to do that. And I think, I suppose it's a disquiet with how the way that volunteering is kind of, the notion of kind of volunteer management and audit and measurement they're almost invisibilized. They're just like, well, those are the norms now. We have to measure volunteering. We have to work out, I'm always having conversations with them, well, how do we measure it? And I kind of think the question to me is not how do we measure it, but why do we measure it? And I think those things are kind of assumed. And one of the things that your question made me think about a little bit was that in the work in Uganda, we've really been struggling with the languages to use. So we've started working much more kind of geographies of the everyday, rather than, which really resonates with your work as well, that rather than this kind of, there's this language about formal and informal that I see a lot, that I'm very uncomfortable with for all sorts of reasons. And we've been trying to think about how do we move away from that, because again, this formal and informal is very fixing. And in the big survey, we did a survey of more than 3,000 young refugees volunteering in Uganda. And the participation rate in volunteering amongst that group is something like 65%. It's huge. What's really interesting is most of them volunteer in what we would describe as very everyday, kind of happenstance, fairly fluid ways. What most stakeholders think about is these very programmed service delivery oriented things. So you've got this really weird disjuncture. So I think you're right to flag it up. And I think what's really interesting about that is your point about the kind of individualization, which connects to the citizenship point. The example I always draw on is actually work in Burundi that I was going to link with, and I have wonderful PhD students just finishing some work on volunteering in Burundi, where the kind of individualization and the programmatic way of this has by particularly the Burundian Red Cross, has been rejected. And so their volunteering is a much more collective endeavor. It's much more about community. And when there is kind of remuneration available for volunteering, it doesn't necessarily accrue to individuals. It might accrue to a community who've agreed to give voluntary labor in particular ways. And so I think your point about how we step away from this is probably that we need to look at more examples. We need better data on more examples of voluntary labor that often is not called voluntary labor. It might often be table labor activism or all sorts of other things, to try and capture that, because we're so captured by some of these languages. I don't think we're even aware we're captured by some of those languages. I think this relates to your point about the kind of cosmopolitanism and citizenship, and the point, I suppose, to extend what I just said then, is that, you know, cosmopolitanism is a very problematic term, and it means many, many things, not all of which are commensurate. And I suppose I've been more interested in my other work on Indian activism, on kind of non-elite cosmopolitanism, and kind of what Uma Katari talks about as kind of the kind of strategic and kind of openness and so on. That the debates around cosmopolitanism and global citizenship have infused through this focus on the individual. So they're very conveniently landed on this kind of sense of you as an individual in a collective endeavor, and we've sort of fudged the issue. And like you said, it's never felt very comfortable. I think, to me, the challenge is, how do we again destabilize that individualization? Can we still use some of these languages? I thought the interesting example I remember in Burundi is a community coming together for the first time because a refugee community had arrived there, and collectively expressing support for that community and helping them till land and support them. Something one would often regard as kind of very strongly cosmopolitan, but it wasn't individual, and it wasn't really about an individualized mode of citizenship. So I agree, and I think we've got some problems there in volunteering about that kind of individualization. Then onto your final two questions. I think that I'm really glad you like that thing about kind of someone moving through those spaces and migration, and that's really informed quite a lot of what I've been trying to do, not always successfully, but trying to do since. And I think, and that notion of traces to me is really, really important. And I think part of that is connected to trying to be a bit more open, that volunteering means really, really different things to different people at different moments in their life course and in different places and from different positions of kind of vulnerability and so on. And our work in Uganda has really flagged up and so the work, the ESRC project that I'm running, Economic Social Research Council project that I'm running in Uganda, but also other work that we're doing in Uganda, where the relationship between volunteering and work and labor is very, very strong. And for many young people, volunteering is a form of precarious work. And so that form of precarious work carries with someone if they are displaced or they're moving somewhere else. And as an understanding of volunteering, it sits really uneasily with how volunteering might be understood somewhere else. And so you've got this very strong senses of what volunteering means, kind of circulating and clashing and crashing into things. But no one really talks about it. It's as if volunteering is a known, shared, lovely thing we all know about. It's all fine. We know what to do. And yet, how you experience it, whether you participate in it, if you're excluded from it, there's a very strong. I've written a little bit about it. A very strong gendered dimension to this, and we can connect that, to much wider debates about kind of care and kind of care ethics and voluntary labour and so on. But that we need to open up the kind of temporalities and the mobilities we think about, because what it does is reveal that this landscape of volunteering is far more uneven than perhaps we're prepared to talk about. And then the very notion of what kind of labour it is tends to just kind of go, well, people are volunteering. You think, yeah, but if someone was volunteering and it meant this and it was part of the work we're doing in Uganda shows that volunteering is a really key part of young people's livelihood strategies, and they name and frame it in particular ways. And I suppose that links then to your final question then about mobility and the example that I'm really thinking of, that's actually some data I was looking at a week or two ago, was young people talking about how the most vulnerable within particular settings couldn't volunteer because within, say, a large refugee settlement, they couldn't reach the place where the best volunteering opportunities were because they couldn't afford the transport, right? So that kind of mobility and fixing at a very different scale at one level really important. But then you raise the other important about how do these ideas, what other kinds of mobilities, how do ideas mobilize and move in different ways? And I think there's something further to be looked at about how different ideas of volunteering circulate through different kind of institutional systems. So you look at United Nations volunteering, for example, well, you know, they of course are trying to embrace a very kind of wide range of understandings of volunteering, but it's also attached to particular forms of measurement and quantification. And so when volunteering lands in a particular place, say by the UNDP office, it comes attached to all those particular things. And it comes with a cachet. So that idea has circulated and moved, and it moves through organizations and policies. But of course, if you read, you know, wonderful work my friend Nina Laurie on the kind of and the stuff on traveling technocrats, those policies and ideas are moving with people. So it comes back to my point that the mobilities of someone who is maybe displaced and how they carry volunteering is important. The mobility of someone who worked in the offices in Bonn, who ends up in a field office in Uganda, who is developing a volunteering opportunity in a refugee settlement in Bidi in northern Uganda, they embody these ideas of voluntary labour. And there are these kind of traces of all these things that are moving and circulating, but we're not really acknowledging what happens when we do that. And more importantly, whose ideas of volunteering get to count, whose land most powerfully and dominate who gets to do what and in what ways, and who is allowed to be more kind of transgressive, who is allowed to kind of behave in ways that are much more challenging to these systems, and who is actually really just doing the service delivery stuff. I'll stop there. But thank you for the question. That was great.
Thank you, both of you. I have to say, I find it very hard to be in this difficult position of having to stop this wonderful conversation. When you're totally immersed in it, I'm in a very difficult position here. But thank you, both of you, for your insights into this. And I would like to ask Davide if there's any question from the audience on YouTube.
At the moment, no, we don't have a question in the chat. Just wanted to remind to anyone who's watching on YouTube, please use the chat if you have any questions, and feel free really to post them in there, and we'll make sure that our guests will discuss your points. So thanks very much. And yeah, there's still a lot of time for questions.
Yeah, and from our colleagues on Zoom, if anyone has got some questions, we have a few minutes before we break for a short time. Feel free to ask questions to Matt and Giovanna.
I have a question, please.
Thanks, Lulu. Hi, sure.
Yes. Hi, hello. I mean, this discussion is amazing. My background is economics, so I look at volunteering from a very different angle altogether from the two of you. But I was wondering, in this case, what is the motivation? Why would a young person in that situation want to volunteer? What is the motivation? Is there a reward, or is it completely altruistic? It's very fundamental, it's a very basic question.
Great question. Do you mean in terms of, say, someone like the migrant you were talking about?
Yes, exactly.
So, and I'm sure Giovanna will have something to say on this as well. And I think what's very, I think there are a number of things to say about motivation. And you know, because there's lots of work on motivation and volunteering, and those motivations are not fixed. That's the first thing I would say. One of the interesting things we did on our survey in Uganda was to give people multiple options for talking about what motivates them, because they may change through the course of a day, an evening, a week, whatever, because they're navigating precarity in particular ways. I think certainly in our data in Uganda, which is not published yet, but I'm really happy to talk to people further about it outside the context of this, that there are lots and lots of things going on. So one, of course, is absolutely about forms of remuneration. So certainly our data is showing that the way that volunteering is a form of livelihood strategy, where people can't access other meaningful forms of work, or they can't access formal systems of employment because they're barred from doing so because of state action and so on, that prevents them being able to participate in labour. Then actually the remuneration you get for your volunteering is obviously really key. And I've written a little bit about volunteer remuneration separately, because in a sense it's a bit of a Pandora's box, because people kind of, that whole thing, well, then it's not volunteering. That argument, to my mind, only applies if you say we use ideas of volunteering that emerge from North America. If you spend time in, talking to folk in Global South, totally different equation. So remuneration is part of it. I think one of the things we've certainly come up with for young refugees volunteering is the way that if you can't access forms of employment and training and skills and so on, actually being a volunteer is actually also tied up with things like transitions to adulthood. And that's been written about elsewhere. I've done a little bit about it in other places, where actually being a volunteer is a way of saying, yeah, but I work, I do work, and that's important to me. I think one of the other motivations is around connections and place and solidarity, that actually for young refugees arriving in Uganda, in particular, who've arrived recently, participation in voluntary labour is a way to build connection and find place, but also to shape place. So particularly if within a settlement within Uganda, that being volunteer is a way of kind of being part of the decision-making processes. Now, none of that is to say volunteering actually does those things. Sometimes it does, quite often it doesn't. But those are certainly, in our data, some of the motivations for why people do these things. And the other final thing to say about it is that those carry on over many, many years. We've done some biographical interviews with people who arrived a long time before they arrived in Uganda to talk to them about what happens how have they volunteered over, say, 10, 15, 20 years. And it kind of it waves through their lives, right? It's not as if it's like, emergency response, I need to do something. It's not, it's a part of their life course. And so the motivation for it will shift and change at different points, even if the kind of precarity that they experience hasn't changed. But the way volunteering fits into it shifts. So I don't know, Giovanna, you may have other things to say. Sorry, I've spoken far too long about that because I get overexcited about it. So I'll shut up and I'll hand over.
Maybe the way we could do is picking up other comments on these questions later on in the second half, so that we try our best to keep on time. So that Giovanna, through your work, perhaps you can address Nilu's comment and maybe add to what Matt was saying. So I suggest that I wish there was more time for questions now, but I'd suggest that you keep them for later on. So hopefully we'll keep our 10 minutes questions for later. And now we take a very short break, 5 minutes, to gather our breath and get ready for the second half of this exciting conversation. And then I'm sure we will be able to comment further and ask more questions then.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Let's take a little break. Thank you. Such a short break, 5 minutes. We're back for the second half of the conversation, and we follow a similar pattern. So half an hour for Matt and Giovanna to discuss the research. Giovanna is going to take us through her work, and Matt will have comments, questions, and we take it from there. We'll also have time for questions at the end, but nevertheless, you can use the chat to post your questions as we're going along. So that's it from me. Over to you, Giovanna. I will appear just for timing reasons, but as I said, I've been put in this horrible position of having to keep the time, but I know that we all have a busy lives, so you'll see me appearing again after these first 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Great, thank you, and thank you again for giving me this chance. So I would like to kind of to start giving you a bit of context. I mean, probably I just already mentioned something, and Elisa also said something while presenting me. But however, the research we're discussing today was part of my PhD work. So, however, the paper in particular that we are using as sort of basis platform to discuss was written, and the research was carried out with Professor Federica Cavallo. So I want also to mention her and thank her because of the support and the work we did together, which is very important. As I said before, the PhD work that was the great big content, like a kind of box where I put all of this, was a comparative work. So I researched Lampedusa in Italy and Lesbos in Greece on a comparative basis. And in particular, worked on what I defined migrant support volunteer tourism. However, as I said, to narrow down today to something a bit more handy, I would talk only of the case of Lesbos. And Lesbos, as you already know, was involved in the so-called refugee crisis in 2015, and as a consequence, international NGOs, grassroots organizations, volunteers arrived on the island to support migrants. Most of them from the Northern Europe, but not only, of course, really from all over the world. So this is kind of the context where I frame my research. I think what I would like to do now is to highlight two main points, which are kind of interrelated, and which I hope will be able to, bring farther this discussion. So first of all, the first point would be on the definition of migrant support volunteer tourism and volunteer tourists. As this was a sort of experiment from me, and I choose to find a way to define this specific type of volunteer tourism, as it was for me very useful to frame then my work. And in particular, I define migrant support volunteer tourists, those people who travel for self-centered and or altruistic motives to a border, who travel to a border space outside their everyday life environment, with the goal of bringing support and relief to migrants or to join migrant-related projects and initiatives. So the reason why I wanted to now focus on this definition for a minute is that, first of all, because this is a very good chance to kind of test it once more and, even have some feedback and so on, but also because I have the chance to discuss it with Matt, who's, of course, didn't focus on volunteer tourism specifically, but on international volunteering more broadly. So I think it's interesting to kind of have this two sides of a phenomenon that has, of course, it's within the same, let's say, big frame. It would be interesting also to retrace the reasons why we can kind of talk about differently about volunteer tourism and volunteering, let's say. On the other hand, I think it's interesting to focus on this definition because I found myself in the position of try kind of justify my choice, and not only in the context of the research, so academia, which of course is normal. I mean, when you decide to use a definition, you have to explain why you're doing that. So, but besides that, I also found myself explaining or justifying it when questioned by volunteer tourists themselves. So, of course, this is not new at all in tourism studies and in general in volunteer tourism studies as well. But it was interesting for me to see that almost all participants to my research stated that we're not volunteer tourists, but rather just volunteers. Again, in particular, I have to say that the case of Lampedusa was slightly different from the one in Lesbos, as in Lampedusa, they were slightly keener to see themselves as volunteer tourists rather than just volunteers. But this, I think, it was because of the projects, the type of projects carried out in Lampedusa, and because of the subjectivities I met. So this, again, maybe brings back to what Matt was saying to us before. But this being said, again, like the rejection of the label of tourist is not new at all. So I'm not saying something completely out, that you don't know already. But I think it's very interesting that, the phenomenon of differentiate oneself from other travelers is still quite common. And of course, it is connected also to the idea of superficiality and the responsibility of tourism itself. Again, this mostly outside the academia, but not only. However, the getting to the point here is that for what concerns my research, the focus on volunteer tourism, so the touristic aspect also of volunteering, was very important. Indeed, what I was able to do is that looking at volunteer practices as tourists allowed me to have a different perspective on volunteers themselves. So not only focusing on their time and space of volunteering, but outside also that frame. So in other words, I tried to investigate what volunteers would do and where they would go on these islands, of course, in the context of Lampedusa and Lesbos during their free time. So when off volunteering, when not engaging in the volunteer work in itself. So this leads to my second point, which is the fact that I tried to use Lefebvre's triad in the context of volunteer tourism in Lesbos in this case. And as I just mentioned, not really to analyze what happens within the volunteering enclaves, so that space where volunteers would go and work with migrants, so the camps or community centers and so on, but outside them. So basically when volunteers are more tourists than volunteers. So rethinking of Lefebvre's triad, so perceived, conceived, and lived space outside also the urban context where it was theorized at the beginning from Lefebvre himself, helped us, me and Federica, to dissect volunteer tourism experiences and their practices and kind of recompose them, making sense not only of the personal experiences and the effect of volunteer work itself, but more broadly, it helped us to make sense of the co-production also of social and relational spaces on the island of Lesbos, again, in this specific case. And in this sense, maybe I can see some convergences with Matt's work, of course, again, with the differences that are there, but with the idea of the use of the assemblage thinking, the kind of considering all of this different also intersections and encounter of different elements. So just to go back to the case of Lesbos, in this study, the result was that we were able to identify various ways that the island was represented by volunteers, ways that, like some representations that were sometimes confirmed by then their practices and their experiences, but sometimes were challenged by them. So just to give you a quick example, sometimes this humanitarian a representation of the island was confirmed by their practices on Lesbos, for example, going to visit spaces which were strongly related to the arrival and the passage of migrants, but in other contexts, they were able to challenge this. Some representations that were also kind of let's say mainstream, if you want to call it like that. Anyway, one of, for example, the most interesting result in this sense is that some of the spaces where volunteer tourists spent their free time ended up being spaces, very common spaces, but with particularly important connotation for what concerned the personal experience and the realm of passion. So basically what was considered the lived space, the lived level of space. So these are spaces where the specialized experiences then united people took form. To make it a bit more concrete, there were some for example, bars or restaurants. There were places where the connections with people and places were created very strongly through immaterial ties, and where volunteers could engage not only with other volunteers, not only with migrants, but also with locals, and on completely different level from what could happen in other spaces of the island, like compared to the camp, for example. So this resulting in the creation of a place where the phenomenon of migration and the people who were part of it in the general like ensemble of people could meet and could engage in an environment of normality, let's say. So just to go towards a conclusion, I think that in those sort of places, volunteers' presence and the networks and the relationship that they created did not only bring a transformation, a physical transformation of those spaces because of their presence, but it also changed the imaginative, the affective, the social qualities of those spaces. So in this sense, I think that the meanings that those spaces were carrying were sort of stratified. So adding more to what just a bar or a restaurant could be in the conceived level, but they were able to add meaning in order to also deconstruct the normativity of the border, what it should it was supposed to be from a conceived top-down level, and so also the hierarchies intrinsic in this sort of humanitarian spaces. And of course, this is not a way to say that all problems were solved there, but it kind of gave us some example of what other possibility exists. And maybe I'll stop here, so I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Giovanna. Lots of food for thought. Matt, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Giovanna. I mean, fab. And I'm going to struggle to keep to my 10 minutes just to make Elisa nervous now. So I really enjoy this. There were so many resonances. It was kind of like you said at the start, right? It was really interesting because in a sense I was talking about different kinds, some international volunteer mobility, some kind of non-mobile forms of volunteering, and yet there were loads of resonances with the things that you were talking about in it. And you've prompted me to think about some really key things about the kind of spaces of what constitute volunteering spaces. So what I thought I'd do is, there are kind of three things that I thought I'd kind of sort of reflect back on what I kind of feel like the paper does and what I think is really exciting. And then sort of a few questions that I'll come to right at the end, to which sort of try and pull that all together. Some of them aren't very questiony, some of them are a little bit, wow, this is really interesting. I haven't necessarily got a questiony kind of question. But you know, the first thing to say is thank you to you and your colleague for doing the work, and it's clearly grounded in some really fabulous qualitative research, and that's always just such a lovely thing to kind of to read and hear about. And you know, thinking about the contested space that you're working in and the complexity around it. I mean, I'm sure you haven't spoken about it, but I don't think any of us on this call would underestimate how difficult it is to do good research in these kind of spaces and navigate those spaces. So I think that's really worth acknowledging at the start. For me, I thought there were three great things that the paper does. So I think the first one is about the kind of challenge to established spatializations of volunteer tourism. And what I really love is, and I say this as a development academic who's worked on NGOs, that you don't take us into the bureaucratic and administrative spaces of volunteering and volunteer tourism. The paper doesn't go there. We're not in those kind of things. And it also doesn't take us into the kind of established humanitarian imaginaries of kind of care and so on. We don't go in that space at all. And so it's really interesting when you set up the paper and you think, well, that's interesting. Where are we going to go if we're not going in there? It's kind of what I felt. I became very interested. And I think it demands we rethink what the spaces of volunteer tourism are. And when we mean volunteer tourism, what are the spaces we are talking about and what are the practices we're talking about? And I think it's really interesting, as I think I said earlier, that in international volunteering and kind of development volunteering, research has been very critical and said, it's very problematic, but it stayed largely within its grip. Actually, the research has sort of said, oh, this is all very problematic, but we've stayed within its grip. And I think that's what, and we've looked at the spaces and subjectivities curated by the gap year industry, curated by international volunteering for development. And instead, you don't stay contained with that. I think it's really interesting. You're looking at that kind of engagement and production of spaces outside those imaginaries, outside the bordering geopolitics, in relation to them, undoubtedly, but in a sense, you take us somewhere else. And to me, there's this kind of really interesting ambivalence about volunteer tourist participation that I really welcome, that sense of in-betweenness. There's a kind of liminality, I think, in there that I thought that was fab. I thought the second thing that I really liked was, and you flagged this earlier, the echo with some of the things I've been thinking about how volunteer identities and subjectivities move within and between spaces. So when you're talking about how the kind of volunteer identity travels with people when they're not doing their volunteering, but they're visiting somewhere and they're in a particular place. But that isn't uniform. It depends on the place they're in, and it depends on where they started from. And it's much more complex and nuanced. And I thought the point about visiting the kind of life jacket kind of mountain being a volunteer, it's a really interesting parallel to stuff that I've done in the past on faith-based international volunteering, where you get a sense of when they encounter something like that. In the case of our project, very severe poverty and injustice, how volunteering is a kind of sense-making identity for them. It's a way of rationalizing their presence in a space, and they often use it to differentiate. Well, I can cope with this, or I can be in this space. I have an identity available to me because of my volunteer identity that somebody else doesn't. And so I thought that was really interesting about showing how those kind of things moved, and that volunteering is much more entangled with kind of geopolitics, lived experience, subjectivity than perhaps we're prepared to talk about, and that it doesn't fit kind of very uniform kind of models that you might think were the case if you read a lot of work. And then my third thing that I really enjoyed was about how volunteer tourism might open up spaces of contestation and reworking and challenge. And I really like this because I think it works, and I think that's really important. I think certainly in my kind of work on volunteering and development and the gap here in the past and so on, there always seems to be this kind of manic search for the kind of the holy grail of political possibility. There's got to be something in there. We know what we're looking at is deeply, in my area, deeply embedded in colonialism. It's racialized, it's gendered, only some people get to move. This is not sounding like a good story, folks, of young British teenagers traveling to places and building something not needed and coming home. And yet we continue looking for the possibilities. And there are, some scholars would just outright critique, we forget about it. And then there's perhaps others, myself, I suppose, is trying to find those spaces of possibility. So there is this kind of holy grail. What I really liked is you offer a way to do that. I think that's really, really interesting, that by looking at how volunteer subjectivities move between spaces, how it fosters relationalities and connections outside and around the kind of formal programming, you get this real sense of actually there is a possibility for different kinds of contestation and different kinds of kind of transgression and so on, which I really liked. And I thought there was a really interesting parallel. Nina, Laurie and I wrote a paper a few years ago about happenstance and volunteering and the kind of the accidental. And I thought that had an echo with that, the things we focus on are the programmed, the audited, the managed, the reported. What your paper says, actually the interesting stuff is going on around the edges. It's happened, it's not planned, it's not audited, it's not measured, it might not even be supposed to be happening because it may not have a health and safety, whatever attached to it. So I thought that was really interesting. And then you'll highlight the cafes and bars as kind of the sites of these alternatives. It's just great. I thought that was really, really powerful part of the paper. And I suppose my final comment really was that a focus on the kind of NGOization or a focus on volunteering activity, if those would miss all this. And I think that's what's so interesting. We go back to my point about how research is often very contained by the institutional agendas in kind of the global humanitarian development tourism landscape. If we're not really careful, our research agendas can remain very contained by those. And you've managed to kind of remove yourself from that and kind of take away that, and I really liked it. I think it really made me think, this is, it's great to see these other spaces. And so it led me to kind of three questions, and I apologize in advance, they may not be questions, they may be, I don't know what they are, they're things. I'm going to say three things and we'll see what they feel like when they land. So the one question I had was, given the way that volunteer identities move in these spaces you're talking about, actually what are the touristic practices? Because in a way, they're inflected in these ways that are so interesting. And we're going back to your point that you made earlier about traces, these traces carrying through all the stuff. I almost wondered about, does your research almost collapse this binary that we need to get away from this tourism volunteer binary, as you were saying about in Lampedusa, people talking differently and so on, that actually almost what counts as which, when are people being which, because they're inflected in different ways. I think the second question I had was about, you talk about these kind of volunteering spaces, and I started thinking about what activities count and whose activities count when we're looking at this, and who is a legitimate actor in this sort of space now. So are there some hierarchies of authority once you take out, and once people are in the cafe or in the bar, what does that do to the hierarchies of, well, normally I'm the volunteer and I'm doing the thing. Now I'm in the cafe where, and I'm with a migrant, and it destabilizes. And I was really interested in how that might land. And I don't know if that's a question or if that's just a research project, but and then the third thing I really want to know, and this is a bit of indulgence really, but I think your research, you were saying this is part of doctoral research and so on, that opens up all sorts of interesting things. And I kind of want to know, and maybe this is an indulgent question, I just want to know what next. What are you going to do next? And I realize that isn't really about the paper, but I'm sure other people would like to know that too. So I think those are my questions. I hope they weren't too rambling.
Thanks, Matt. And over to you, Giovanna, for the last 8/10 minutes. So we hopefully we'll have a few minutes for questions at the end. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Matt, for your comments and your questions. I really found them very, useful, and also they make me feel quite good about my work. Sometimes it's useful, I think. So thanks. But besides that, I'll try to reply to your questions quite shortly to give time to questions. So to begin with, what you said also, before your questions, actually, just one word about the idea of the accidental happening, related to volunteering. For example, in Lesbos, everything started a bit accidentally, let's say accidentally in the sense that many of the NGOs now working there were actually created after the first arrival of migrants, and they were created also by people who were just there as tourists and decided they had to help. And then they decided, let's make an organization and kind of give an order to all this. So it was interesting also, just to underline this, as you mentioned, the kind of accidental possibilities. But besides that, so when people are tourists and when there are volunteers, if I can sum up like the question like that, I think, of course, in their practices, in the practices I've been observing in Lesbos in particular, the practices that we can find are very entangled. I mean, as tourist practices and volunteer practices, as I try also to mention quickly in the paper, but then I kind of studied it more broadly for the PhD research. These volunteers, and this maybe also answer the question about the motivations. These volunteers very often went to Lesbos also, of course, to help and to to do something, but also because they wanted to understand what was going on. So there was already like a reason of discovery, as a motivation of wanting to understand and wanting to engage in something that was happening, in that particular moment. And at the same time, in order to do that, they traveled around the island, they explored the island, looking for those spaces and those also symbolic sites related to migrants' arrival and passage or death in many cases. For example, you mentioned the life jacket graveyard, where all the life jackets of people who arrived were kind of discarded. And I mean, I don't see these practices as completely separate from, the practice of being a volunteer. I mean, it was also a way to make sense of their presence there as volunteers. So from that point of view, I think that there is a lot that we can see as overlapping, or kind of anyway making sense as an ensemble. So we cannot really, I think, separate what they do as volunteers and what they do as tourists. Of course, then they would go to the beach and they would go swimming. But I mean, you are on a beautiful island, which is another motivation I found among my volunteers, like the participant to my research. I had 2 weeks, I want to do something useful, and I can go to a beautiful island in the Mediterranean. So this is part of their motivations as well. And there is nothing, I think, weird about it. I think it's part of what push people to volunteer as well. To kind of go on, and about the volunteering spaces and the hierarchies and the functioning of those spaces. This is a difficult question to answer, because on one hand, I wouldn't say that some hierarchies that we find, or some mechanisms that we find in other contexts, are completely absent, are completely broken up, and so on. Of course, there are still like some privileges that we cannot ignore, even just like, if you're a white person or not, it makes a difference. So I wouldn't, I can't say that doesn't exist. What happens, I think, is that in some of these spaces, the conditions that are created kind of open up a little bit more the possibilities of same level encounter, in the sense that, first of all, for example, people can bring something of their experiences in those spaces. I made the example of the Nan restaurant, where refugees can work and they're paid for to work there, which is not very common, unfortunately, in Lesbos, because it's very complicated for refugees to work. But they are in that moment, they're not even more the migrants, the refugees. There are help, but they are people who work in the restaurant. They are those people who are welcoming then maybe the volunteers who go eating there, and somehow this changes the perspectives and the scales, the hierarchies. At the same time, of course, this has to be facilitated by someone. So, and in the cases I'm mentioning, these are basically local people or activists that somehow intentionally created those spaces. So, I mean, it's not just, something that naturally happens, but I think this maybe is kind of obvious. So it's not easy to answer, because there's a sort of a sort of mix of what would happen outside. So it's not completely I wouldn't say it's a completely liberated space, but I think something slightly different happened. So that's already, the first step. And also, I think an interesting aspect is that those are the few places where actually volunteers are able to interact also with locals, which is interesting enough. Otherwise, they would only interact when going to the shop to buy, I don't know, groceries and so on. In those spaces, they are actually able to interact in different ways and really get to know each other. So also it's quite interesting, even though it was not my focus, but that was another aspect I think it would be interesting to work on. And going to the last question, what next? That's also not easy to answer. For sure. I mean, for now, I'm not being able to keep working on this path. But what I think would be really, really interesting to do, and I hope that's going to happen, is to kind of see what happened now after COVID-19, because like both islands were completely changed, the situation completely changed after COVID-19 pandemic, and that's something that I mean is quite relevant also from refugees' point of view. Just to mention quickly 2 points. In Lesbos, the main camp was destroyed. Now the camp is another one. Volunteering was hindered a lot during COVID-19, as you already know. And now it's kind of reassembling, like reconstructing itself. And on Lampedusa, for example, they created this sort of new institution, which are the quarantine sheeps, which are still used after the crisis of COVID. So, something new is happening and it should be studied, I guess. So I'll quit here, so I'm not taking too much time, but thank you again for your questions.
Yeah, I'm just chipping in quickly because we got a question from our audience in YouTube, and we won't have too much time for questions, so I'd really like to hear your view on that. It's apologies if I don't pronounce correctly. I think it's Tier asking this question, and they were asking. They were wondering how both of you see the future of volunteering or volunteering, and what could possibly be the holy grail. So a very easy question for you to kind of probably wrap up with.
Okay, you'll notice that neither of us went first. Giovanna, do you want to go first? And
it's the same. It's really the same as you prefer. Do you want me to go?
I'll dive in, just partly because it's easy to answer to say I don't know, but there's a slightly more interesting answer maybe, which is maybe a note of caution. So I think one of the things that's certainly happening in the space that I work in is that the reduction in international mobility into international kind of travel has led to a couple of kind of responses. So one is there's the growth on e-volunteering, but the other is a sudden, it is as if local volunteers didn't exist until COVID-19 happened. It's as if you can see people going, wow, but local volunteers, brilliant, we'll support them. And you sort of think these folk are a category that we better not be really careful to suddenly invent that suits our purposes now that international mobility is reduced after COVID, now that there's recognition, much better recognition of the climate emergency and impacts and so on. But then there's this risk, right? So this category of volunteer, who were people within their communities undertaking care solidarity work for a long time, are now suddenly becoming a new subject of interest for international organizations. And there is a risk that they then become suddenly required to deliver all sorts of other things. So it's as if the kind of that form of volunteering is the next focus of our attention, without really starting from understanding what it is, what the histories of it are, what some of the inequalities and kind of power differentials are that characterize those kinds of volunteering. So for me, I don't really have an answer about what the future is. I do have an answer about what I'm nervous about, which is this sudden rush to find another category because the ones we were using have been destabilized or questioned. So that would be my answer.
I'll add something real quick, even because as Matt said, I'm not quite sure I have an answer for this question, but what came to my mind actually when you asked this question was, and sorry if I bring the kind of attention on something else right now, but it's what's happening, for example, with the war now in Ukraine. So, I mean, as I work also with refugees and so on, my thought immediately went there, and I'm not sure what will happen, but I mean, some things are already moving around. People are, you know, going towards those that area, not literally in Ukraine, but some there, some in the bordering countries. People are coming here. So I'm not, again, I don't have an answer, but this was the first thing that came up to my mind. And I think we should, well, keep high the attention on that as well. And I'll just be here.
I was on mute. Apologies. Just chipping in with one more question from our chat, and actually, you know, they've been all quiet, and now we're kind of getting a lot of questions. So we'll try and be quick because we're about to wrap up. Nectar Kahana is making a good comment in terms of saying, she's saying, I really like the idea of volunteering as a black box that we need to unpack, besides how and why we measure. I think it also raises the question of what we measure. And she was wondering if volunteers do not come across immigrants in their own countries, and why they volunteered abroad and not in their own countries. In other words, what are the pull factors for volunteer tourism in this context? We would have one more question probably. So let's see if we can try and say something about both. But yeah, let's go with this first one. Maybe one of you can answer this one and the other can answer the next one before we will wrap up, if that's okay.
Sure, maybe I can say something about the refugees, if you're fine with that, Matt. I mean, at least for my research and what I've been able to see, why they go abroad to volunteer. First of all, because as I said, it's kind of an attraction to go somewhere where you can see a sort of crisis, so something more obvious, more just bigger, probably. And again, this brings back to the question of the reasons why people volunteer. I mentioned it before. In my case, was like we want to understand what's going on. We want to do something, and at the same time, in places where camps are located, for example, in Lesbos and in Lampedusa, there is also sort of infrastructure to do that. It's kind of also easier in that sense, because it's there, it's available, and again, as for me, it has also something to do with the intention to discover something different in another context, which is outside their everyday life, even because it's part of an idea of being a tourist there, even though maybe they don't recognize themselves as tourists. So I don't know if I answered a bit. Maybe Matt had something more to say about that, but I think these are kind of going to the core of the events is one of the main points.
Myself, just wanted to give some more room to another comment in the chat. I think, yeah, it's I don't know if it's more of a question or a comment, so I'm going to read it out. It's from Seda Tavsankoru. Thanks, Seda, for your comment. So she say, my research is about workaway kind of volunteer tourism space. Host and volunteer tourists share the space gathering around off-grid practices, where we can speak about transmodern decolonial socialization of power. Through your experiences, what do you think about the camp space and power relations when you compare the gathering of these global actors in the camp? That's kind of the, yeah, what Seda would like to to hear from you. Once again, another big big thing to try and answer concisely.
I'll say something quickly and then Giovanna maybe. So the first thing is to say that the paper we've just spoken about doesn't really connect to that. The work that we're doing in Uganda does, but it's important to distinguish, although there's a politics around this, between kind of refugees in Uganda and within settlements, but also within urban contexts, which are not referred, they're not referred to as camps and they're understood in the conventional way, but there is a politics to that. So we need to be a little bit careful about kind of what we mean by that. I think for me, the most important thing in response to your question, I think it's really interesting, is that volunteering, we can't abstract volunteering for these very complex geopolitics that constitute what these spaces are. And so it's made through and against the forces that define spaces for migrants and refugees. And so at one level, you have sets of kind of interactions and connections and hierarchies that drop down from that kind of those very powerful actors and the kind of bordering that goes on and the kind of demarcations that go on. You've then got other forms of kind of voluntary labour as well that are being worked and reworked as a way of contesting those kinds of spaces. I think for me, the whole point about the kind of assemblage way of thinking is that nothing is static in that. There is a constant push and pull and flow and fluidity and movement and hierarchy. And you know, someone might one day be a volunteer with an organisation doing X, and the next afternoon they're doing it with someone else, and they're doing something else, and the next morning they're doing something else. And in a way, I suppose my response to that is that there are these kind of fleeting moments of change and possibility, but they are having to work both through and against these kind of very powerful kind of framings of who is allowed to be where and when. And so that circumscribes some of those possibilities, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking, and it sounds like your research is doing that. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking for those kind of much more transgressive kind of possibilities.
Thank you both. I think we're running out of time, so I think this is a good time to wrap up. Thank you for both of you for exposing us to new ways of looking at volunteering and volunteer tourism, and in fact, I enjoyed a lot thinking about volunteer tourism as much more fluid reconfigurations, particularly now that the world is changing so fast, and as you said, is very much we should be thinking of volunteering and volunteer tourism within specific spaces and temporalities. So thank you for your thought-provoking conversation, and I wish we had more time really. So maybe in the future you hear from us again, and maybe we can carry on discussing new modes of doing volunteering and volunteer tourism. So thank you for giving your time to be with us today. Thank you, Leontine. Thank you, Atlas, our school, Davide, and the moderators and guest speakers. Just a little note I forgot to say before that Ellie May, the moderator for today's event, couldn't be with us today, unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances. And so that's why there's me instead. So yeah, I just wanted to mention this before. Just a little reminder also about our next conversation, which is the second one in this series of 3, which is happening on the 11th of May at 9 a.m. UK time. Giovanna and Matt, you're very welcome to join us, of course, as everyone else. And also a little reminder for those of you that are interested in joining the special interest group of volunteer tourism, which David and I co-chair and coordinate. It'd be wonderful, so you can keep up to date with the latest developments in the field. And of course, we welcome many perspectives, views that don't come only from tourism and more kind of leisure studies, but in fact, it'll be even more interesting to have a wide variety of disciplines and views that intersect and that can help us to think about developments of volunteering development and volunteer tourism. So that's all for today. Thank you once again, everyone.
Thank you. It was great, really. Thanks for having us here.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks.
Everyone.